If your household is like ours, the last week or so and probably the next week will be filled up with things that look like this. I don't ever watch figure skating. I don't watch snowboarding. I don't watch luge. I don't watch bobsled. I don't watch any of this stuff any other time except when the Olympics is on. And then suddenly, that's all I end up watching. We end up watching all these Olympic sports that I couldn't normally care less about. But they're on and we're watching them. In particular this year, because Megan is at home and living with us, we're watching a lot of figure skating, because she likes watching figure skating, and we're watching figure skating and snowboarding, because she likes that as well. The one thing I've noticed about each of those sports is that they doing incredible things, you know, like figure skaters will go out and skate around and do like a triple something or another where they jump up in the air and spin around, and snowboarders, they go out and they hit these great big jumps and they flying around and twisting around. But what I've noticed is that it's not often the great big trick that causes them the problem. It's not the great big trick where they lose points. Usually it's something very simple that's caused an issue. A figure skater will be skating along and catch an edge and wipe right out because they caught an edge of their blade. Something really simple that anybody who's just learning to skate would normally know how to do. Or a snowboarder will be coming down the mountain and they hit a great big jump and do all this stuff and then suddenly just lose their balance. You know, that's the very basic thing that you need to ride a snowboard. They kind of lose that very small basic element, and that's the thing that causes the issue. In all these things, of course, all these people are practicing, and when they're out practicing, they often are not practicing their biggest tricks. They're often practicing the simple little things. They are just skating backwards from side to side, from one side of their blade to the other. They're just practicing little, tiny, small, basic elements, because to do the big things, you need the little, tiny, small, basic elements to be right. That's true of everything. That's not just true of the Olympics or true of sports. That's true of anything. If you want to play a piano, you've got to know your scales. You've got to know which keys are which. You've got to know the basics, right? If you are going to ride a bike, you're going to need to know how to balance your bike. That's just really basic, but you have to have that. And if you've lost your balance for some reason, if you have an inner ear infection, you can't ride a bicycle because you don't have that one single element. If you're going to bake a cake, you better understand how to use recipes and how to turn your oven on, right? You've got to have the basic elements to do something bigger. Today's sermon, lots of our sermons talk about the bigger things. Lots of our sermons talk about the big things you ought to go and try and do. Today's sermon, we're going to go back to an elemental sort of thing, to a really basic thought. Because this is true spiritually as well. I think lots of times we get caught up not on the biggest things, but on small little elements, basic things, basic attitudes that we need if we're going to grow spiritually, if we're going to be mature spiritually, if we're going to be the people that we ought to be. As I said before, Jesus taught about one simple, basic attitude, a simple thought pattern. Jesus taught about this thought pattern over and over and over again. And his disciples struggled with this one simple thought pattern over and over again. And the early church struggled with it, and you struggle with it. I don't think you always get it wrong, but I think the times you get it right, it is still a struggle even to get it right. And so this morning, my simple goal is this. I just want to highlight this one attitude. I want to highlight this one thing, because we must get this. We must understand this. We cannot jump over this. We will not get any better than we are about this one little thing. As I said, Jesus taught this lesson in many places. We're going to find it today in Luke chapter 14. Situation in Luke chapter 14 is that it is the Sabbath day. It's their day of worship, and as Jesus always does on the Sabbath day, he has gone to the synagogue. The synagogue is a place of teaching. It is a place where they read scripture. It is a place where they worship God together. It's sort of like church. And they're there on the Saturday morning to worship God. The tradition afterwards was that the leaders of the community would invite people to their homes afterwards on the Sabbath. You couldn't work on the Sabbath, that no one was allowed to work. And so the leaders of the community would often have their servants prepare food ahead of time on the Friday so it was ready for Saturday so that they could have people over to their homes on the Sabbath. And that's what happens in Luke chapter 14. Jesus has gone to church. And one of the Pharisees, one of the leaders of the community, has invited him over for supper. When you go over to someone's house for supper in those days, the seating arrangements were kind of unique. The seating arrangements were not at a big long table like we would sit at. Instead, the table was U-shaped. The U-shaped table, it was a very low sort of table with kind of couches beside them. You kind of leaned on your elbow and ate off the table. But the important point to know about the U-shaped table is this, that the most important person in the room gets to sit at the bottom of the U. The most important person in the room gets to sit at the bottom. And so the next important person gets to sit to his right hand. The next important person from him gets to sit at that person's left hand. And on it goes out around the sides, with the least important being the furthest away from the host. Luke chapter 14, verse 7. When Jesus noticed how the guests picked places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor. For a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will have to come and say to you, give this man your seat. Then humiliated, you will have to take the place of least importance. Stop there for a second. Jesus says as he's watching all these people looking around the room, he can see them looking around the room trying to decide who gets to sit where. Who gets to sit closest to the host? Who gets the most important spot? And the thought in everyone's mind at the dinner party is, am I more important than Larry, or is Larry more important than me? Because they're trying to grade each other because they've got to decide where to sit. As Jesus watches this, he stands back and he tells his disciples, you know what? Don't ever go and take the highest place at the table. Because if you do, maybe there's someone else who's still coming who's more important than you, and if that happens, then the host is going to have to come to you and tap you on the shoulder and say, you're not as important as you think you are. There's somebody more important than you, you've got to move. And he says, then you're going to be humiliated. And you're going to feel ashamed, and you're going to have to get up in front of everybody and say, I'm not as important as this guy. I'm going to have to move down the line. He says, don't do that. Don't take the most important place. What Jesus is looking at as he stands back and watches everybody picking their places around the table, and the problem we're going to deal with this morning, the thing we need to think about, Jesus is concerned about how people deal with their own pride. It is pride that makes people go into a room full of others and say, am I better than you, or are you better than me? How do I grade myself against you? It is our own pride that makes us do that. It is our pride that makes us think about those sorts of things. Pride makes us want to grade ourselves. And pride makes us think about ourselves. And for the rest of the morning, here's what I want to tell you. I think our biggest challenge is we've got to stop thinking so much about ourselves. We've got to stop thinking about ourselves. Because when we think about ourselves, we become prideful. And when we become prideful, we act in horrible sorts of ways. Pride causes us to do all sorts of dumb things, like, again, grade ourselves at a dinner party, trying to decide who's better than whom. But it does other things too. Pride makes me brag about myself, doesn't it? Pride makes me tell you all the good things I've ever done and hide all the bad things I've ever done. Pride makes me put myself in the best spotlight. Pride makes me think about me in the best possible way, better than anyone else, so that I see me better than you even if you're better than me, right? Pride causes me to see things incorrectly and then tell everybody about it. Pride makes me compare. We've already talked about that. But that comparison goes beyond just social standings. Pride makes me compare everything. Pride makes me compare my car to your car, my salary to your salary. Pride makes me compare my education to your education. Pride makes me compare my abilities to your abilities. Pride makes me compare everything. One of the most discouraging things in my early years of preaching was that I found out that a lot of my preaching brothers, and I did it too, because obviously it bothered me, is that we were comparing with each other. Who's getting asked to speak at conferences and who isn't? Who's preaching at a bigger church and who isn't? Who gets paid more? Who gets to write books? Who doesn't? All those things used to bother me. Not because I actually wanted to do them, but because somebody else was doing them. We compare, and when you start comparing, you start disliking what you've got, because there's always somebody better than you. There's always somebody doing more than you. Just pick a spot. You can find it. Comparing. Pride makes us do that, though. It makes us compete. And competition goes hand in hand with comparing. Here's the other thing it starts doing then. Once I don't compete with you anymore, it starts making me put you down. Pride causes me to tear you down, right? I've either got to be better than you, or I've got to show how you're not as good as me, right? So, back to our preaching thing, if somebody else is getting called to speak at a bunch of conferences and I wasn't, I would make myself feel better by the fact that I knew other things about that guy. Well, yeah, everybody might like him. Everybody might think he's a good speaker, but you should get to know him. Right? I'd start putting him down. I'd start looking for his flaws. I'd start looking for the things I think I'm better than him at, because my pride won't allow me to let you be better than me. Right? Pride causes us to start looking for everybody else's faults, so I feel better about myself. Which, really, you understand, is a terrible way to live. Pride makes me focus on what I have or what I do. Right? So just listen to people's conversations once in a while. People's conversations often circle around not what the person they're with is doing or how the person they're with is, but it focuses on whom people talk about themselves. In fact, the old-time book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, that was written back in the 50s, Herb Carnegie or whatever his name was, that was his trick. That was his key. That's the secret. How to make friends and influence people, let them talk about themselves. Get them to talk about themselves. Because if you can get them to talk about themselves, they love you. Because everybody wants to talk about themselves. Our pride loves that. I love to tell you how smart I am. I love to tell you how good I am. We love that. Pride loves to talk about itself. Pride makes me unteachable, though. That's an issue. Pride makes it so that nobody can teach me anything. Because I know everything. Nobody's smarter than me. You can't tell me how to do anything. And I get offended if you try to. Because pride makes me unteachable. Pride also makes me unhelpable. I don't know that that's actually a real word, but you know what I mean. It makes me refuse help. I was just talking to Tom and Amanda about that. I could give you 20 stories about how I probably should have asked for help, but I don't, because I don't want to look weak. I don't want to look like I need help. I want to be proud. I want to be proud and do it on my own, because pride makes me think about me. I don't want to look like I can't do it. Pride also makes me easily insulted or hurt. Pride makes me very defensive, right? Pride makes me argumentative. Pride makes me, again, incorrectable. And when someone tries to correct me or say I did something wrong, it makes me angry. Pride doesn't allow me to be taught. Pride makes me react. Pride is a horrible thing. And this is what Jesus sees as he watches everybody come into the room and think about themselves. Where do I fit in? How do I compare to you? It's their pride that he's dealing with, because all they're thinking about is, am I better than you? And I want to suggest to you that that is not necessarily a horrible thing if you think that way. It's actually a very natural thing. It's just our natural response. You are always going to think about yourself first, which is why this sermon's important. We've got to learn to squash that. We've got to learn to get that under control. We've got to learn to think differently. We've got to choose something else. Because if we don't, this is how we're going to act. I told you the disciples had trouble with this all the time. I don't think we'll look up every one of these verses. If you have a pen and paper, you can write them down, or I'll give them to you later. But you can fill in these blanks for me. Help me write the sermon right now. The apostles had trouble with their pride. They struggled with this. The best people that we know in our Bibles, the people we honor and think are great, had trouble with pride. Do you think I'm wrong? Listen to this. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 33, Jesus and his disciples are walking down the road, and they're walking a little bit behind him. And he can hear they're discussing something, but he can't hear what they're talking about. And so when they get to their destination and they sit down to have their meal, Jesus says to them, "What were you discussing on the road?" And it says in Mark chapter 9 that none of them wanted to answer him. None of them wanted to give him a response. None of them wanted to tell him what they were talking about, because the disciples were talking about what? You know what it is. What were they discussing on the road? Who's the greatest? They were discussing who is the greatest. Not who is the greatest person in the whole world. Not who is the greatest person they've ever met. They were discussing in that group of 12, who's better? Who's the greatest amongst us? Who does Jesus like best? Who preaches the best? Who's the greatest? Does anyone remember what Jesus said to them when they finally did confess? He said, if you want to be the greatest, if you want to be the first, be the last. If you want to be greatest, be the least. Be the servant of everybody else. You've got to get your pride under control. You've got to stop thinking about yourselves. It can't work. You're not going to be my people if you keep thinking about, how do I do this? How do I get ahead? How do I get more? That's not how we think. It wasn't the first time it happened, though, and it's not the last time. The next time I want you to notice is in the very next chapter, Mark chapter 10. Two of the disciples, James and John, come to Jesus. The story's told in two different places, in two different Gospels. In one place, in Mark, it says it was James and John who came and asked this question. In the other place that it's told, somebody else came and asked. Who was it that came and asked this question? Do you remember? It was James and John's mother. Yeah, it might be more true that it was his mom that asked the question. Mark may be saving the mom from... But it sounds like a motherly thing to do. James and John's mom comes and says, when you come into your kingdom, Jesus, when you become the king of the world, would you let my two boys be on your right hand and on your left hand? Would you let my two boys be first and second in command? Right? That's her question. In Mark, it's the boys themselves that say, can we be first and second in command? James and John, or their mother, is thinking about one thing. What are they thinking about? Can we have the best spot? Can we have the most power? Can we be in charge? What can we get here? What can I get? Can I be in charge? Jesus says to them, you don't even know what you're asking. You can't, this isn't going to work out. By the way, after James and John go and ask, can we have the first and second spots in the kingdom? Can we be first and second in charge? It says the other disciples heard about this, and they were what? What's the other disciples' response when they hear that James and John wanted these places of honor. The other disciples were disgusted, angry, disgruntled. Why are they disgusted and angry and disgruntled? Why are the other ones mad about them asking for this privilege? Because they wanted it too. Because everyone's thinking about themselves. Everyone's thinking about themselves. Because that's what we do. One more example for you. I'll read this one to you. This is Jesus. This isn't quite as clear as the other two, but I think this one is just as powerful, maybe even more so. In the sermon that we call the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, Luke records the same sermon in Luke chapter 6. Here's what he says. Jesus says this in verse 41. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye, but pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me pick this speck out of your eye, when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? Do you see what he's saying? He says, you're looking around at your brother's faults. You can see a speck of sawdust in your brother or sister's eye, but you can't see your own faults. Your brother's fault is like a speck of sawdust. Your faults are like a log sticking out of your eye, but you can't see that. All you can see is their fault. Why? Why can you see other people's faults easier than you can see your own? Because your pride causes you to do that. Your pride doesn't let you see your own faults. Your pride thinks of you as being better than you are. So you can see what everybody else is doing that's wrong, but you can't see it yourself. Jesus says, how about this? Why don't you get the log out of your own eye first, and then maybe you can help somebody else? Why don't you get rid of your own sinfulness and stupidity and arrogance, and then you can help somebody else be better? The implication being, of course, you're never going to get to the end of fixing yourself. So why don't you just start there? Once you're done fixing yourself, which will never end, then go pick on somebody else. We want to think about ourselves. We want to think about how good we are. We want to think about how great we are. We always think about how smart we are. Our pride causes us to do this all the time. In fact, it became such a problem in the early church that the Apostle Paul writes this line. And I can't believe he writes this line, but he writes it to a group of Christians. Here's what he says to them. Brothers and sisters, man, let's stop. Let us not become conceited and provoking and envying one another. What are we doing? We are letting our pride ruin everything. We envy each other, and we're conceited, and we're provoking each other. We're causing fights because I just think about me. All I think about is what I want. I don't really care what you want. Paul says that is not how we act. Do not let this happen. This isn't who we are. You don't envy each other. You cheer for each other. You don't tear each other down. You build each other up. But our pride makes us do that. So, here's the tricky part, though. Here's the tricky bit. The tricky part is this. The cure isn't think less of yourself. The cure is not, I think I might have a problem with pride, so I'm going to think worse of myself. I'm going to remember all the bad things I've ever done. I'm going to think about all the stupid things I've ever done. I'm going to think about all the ways I've failed. I'm going to think less of myself. That's going to cure my pride. That's not true. That's not how it works. Well, what happens when you start thinking less of yourself? It doesn't cure your pride. It just makes you what? If you start thinking of all your faults and your problems and your issues and all the things you ever do wrong, it just makes you not prideful. It makes you depressed. It makes you insecure, doesn't it? It just makes you insecure. It's not fixing anything. It's just reminding you of all the things that make you sad. And let me show you this real quick. When you have pride, this is what it does. Guess what insecurity does? Insecurity does exactly the same thing. When I feel insecure, I brag about myself to make you think I'm better. I compare and I compete and I put others down and I focus on what I have or do. Insecurity and pride are cousins. Insecurity and pride are cousins. They sound exactly the same because they're both focused on power. one who thinks they've got lots and one who thinks they have none. Pride and insecurity are cousins. The cure to this problem is not thinking less of yourself. There's another cure, which Jesus is going to show us here in a second, but let me give it to you so you can see it well. The cure to this problem, the thing we've got to learn to do, is this. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. We need to learn to be humble. And humility means not thinking less of yourself, thinking of all your mistakes and stupidity. Humility means that I'm just going to stop thinking about me. I'm just going to think about myself less. I'm just going to stop focusing on me. I'm going to start focusing on someone else. So back to Jesus at his dinner party, where he's talking about people taking the seats at the table. If you go back to Luke 14, here's the end of that story, and here's the end of what Jesus says here. He just finished in verse 9 saying, if you take the best seat and act really pridefully, somebody else might come along, be better than you, you've got to go to the back. So verse 10, here's what Jesus says. But when you're invited, take the lowest place. Jesus says, what would happen if you just took the lowest place? What would happen if instead of trying to brag about yourself all the time and make yourself look so good, what would happen if you just walked into the room and took the lowest place? What would happen in your relationships if you just walked in and stopped thinking about yourself and do people like me and do people want me here and do people think I'm good? Am I doing a good enough job? What if you stopped all that silliness and you just walked in and said, I'm here for you? Well, what if you just thought about being a servant instead of thinking about you? What if you thought about other people instead of thinking about you? What if you just took the lowest spot? What if you just started there? Jesus said, but when you're invited, take the lowest spot, so that when your hosts come, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you'll be honored in the presence of your fellow guests. Look at verse 11. For whoever exalts himself, whoever lets pride take over, whoever wants to make himself look big, will be humbled. But whoever humbles himself, whoever chooses a different attitude, whoever chooses to not think about themselves all the time, they will be exalted. They will be honored. They will be lifted up. They will be useful. They will be someone in the kingdom. What would happen if you just came in and took the lowest spot, Jesus says? What if you just came in and decided to serve and help and intercede for people and give and focus on others and be generous? What if you just changed your audience? What if you stopped thinking about you and start thinking about what God would want here or what others need here? What would happen then? I would suggest to you that it would get us out of a trap. It would get us out of a lot of our issues. It would get us out of most of our problems because too many of us run our lives thinking about what do people think of me. And it's a dangerous way to live. I've shared this quote with my girls as they grew up. I shared this next quote with them several times. I don't know who said it. I don't know who the author is. I don't even know where I got it. But I've shared it with them lots of times because I want them to know this. And I want you to know this today too. This one author said, I want you to keep your own counsel and don't be overly attentive to the opinions of others. High praise can cultivate an inflated ego. Negative criticism can destroy your self-confidence, so form no attachment to external commentary, whether good or bad. Just stop paying attention to that stuff. It's not about you. It's not about what people say about you. It's not about whether people think you're better than them or not. It's not about what you've got. It's not about what you're doing. It's about who you serve. It's about how you live. It's about who you're thinking about. Stop taking a grade from everybody else. Stop thinking about yourself. Go and do something better. Go and do something different. The bottom line for Christian people is that there's only one audience and only one judge. At the end of time, you will not stand to be judged by all your friends. You will not be judged by what you have. You will not be judged by where you've been. You will be judged by the Lord of the universe, who will say to you, were you my child or not? Did you do the things I asked you to do? Did you live your life for me, or did you live it for you? That's going to be the big question. Let me give you this one last thing to think about, and then we'll wrap this up. Remember when Jesus was born? Way back at the start of the Gospels, when Jesus is born, little baby in Bethlehem, there's a king in Jerusalem. The king's name is Herod. Herod hears that this new king, Jesus, has been born. And everybody's talking about the fact that the Messiah has come, that God's new king has shown up. What does King Herod do when he hears that a new king has been born in his kingdom? What does King Herod do? Does anyone remember? He gives an order. And the order is that what?
Kill the children under 2 years old.
Kill all the baby boys under 2 years old. I've heard there's a new king that's been born, and it's been born in the last couple of years, and so I want you to kill every Jewish boy under 2 years old, because I need to get rid of this king. Herod understood one thing that we need to understand. Herod was a terrible man, but he had this one thing right. Herod understood there can't be two kings. There can only be one. And if I want to be king, I better get rid of Jesus. The truth is still true. There can only be one king. There can only be one you're trying to please. There can only be one whose grade matters to you. There can only be one that you think about. There can only be one on the throne of your life. And so the question of this entire sermon boils down to this. Who is on the throne of your life? Who is your king? Is it you? Or is it God? Are you doing the things you want to do? Or are you here to serve? Are you here to help? Are you here to give? Are you here to share? Are you here to be a servant, or are you here to promote yourself? Jesus said, you know what? Don't walk in and think, I'm going to show you how great I am. Walk in and say, I'm going to show you how great I can serve. Those are two completely different ways to live your life. One will be successful, and the other will only lead to heartache. Brothers and sisters, can we make sure that we are not on the throne of our lives? Can we make sure that we are serving Christ? As James says, can we humble ourselves before the Lord? Because if we do that, He will lift us up. Take your communion supplies if you would. If we're talking about humility, if we're talking about not being in charge of our own lives, if we're talking about being here to serve, Jesus is our ultimate example of that, of course. I'm not going to say much about this because I've already said lots. So here's the only thing I'm going to say. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, on the night before he died, had one prayer. And his prayer was this: I don't want to go through this. I don't want to die. I don't want to go through the pain and the suffering. But if this cup can't be taken from me, then not my will, but yours be done. Jesus said all the time, not my will, but yours be done. I want to suggest to you that that is the motto of a Christian. Not my will. It's not about me. I'm going to do what God wants me to do. That is the sign of maturity. That is the sign that we've actually understood. That is the sign that we're living by a different way. Not my will, but yours be done. Let's pray. Father, thank you that your Son came to this earth and did say, not my will, but yours be done. Thank you that he did go through things he didn't deserve so that he could serve us. Thank you that he did give his life so that we could have life. Father, help us to get out of the trap of dreaming about ourselves and promoting ourselves and comparing ourselves. Help us just to remember what's been given to us. Help us to remember we've been given a new start. Help us to live a new life in a new way. Thank you that our sins have been forgiven. We've been freed from all that. Help us to live our new life, thanks to your Son, as we remember his body on the cross this morning in your Son's name. Amen. Others, we remember the blood that washes away all the evil and all the things that would harm us. Help us to remember that we have been washed clean. We can make better choices. We can live by your Spirit. Thank you for the hope that we find in the cross. Thank you for the hope we find in new starts all the time, even when we make mistakes. Help us to keep restarting until we live more like you. Thank you for your Son and his death that gives us that hope. In your Son's name. Amen. For those watching on the video, we'll say goodbye right now. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.